Hi, today is really just about cutting. I'm going to be cutting one of the shadow blocks for my Buckinghamshire series. This is the Buckinghamshire print that's going to look very natural. So I need to drop some shadows in, and here's my block with all the shadows on. This is actually block number 3. It's the sort of mid-tone shadows, and you can see they have a kind of sketchy quality that I'm going to try and keep with my cutting. And I'm going to be cutting away from this block, pretty much sticking to where these blue lines from the carbon paper are. Remove that. Now, one of the things I should say before I start, you'll notice there's a line down here, and that's because the lino, this particular block's just a bit bigger than I want, so I need to lose that bit there at the edge, so I'm going to begin just by taking that off. And now I'm going to switch over to a V tool, and I'm going to start just working into the lino. And here I've got an even finer V tool. This is a little Japanese tool that I really like. So when I'm cutting out these shadows, it doesn't matter if I'm not following exactly to these pencil lines, as long as it's not going to have a negative impact. If you look here at this tree area here, I can mess about with the shadows within the tree quite happily and it not be a problem. But I do need a clean cut where the tree ends, because I don't want like random shadows floating in the sky that don't mean anything. So I am bearing in mind that if I'm leaving extra lino behind, it's in areas where it's meant to be, where there could be shadows, not in places where there definitely wouldn't be shadows. So that's something to bear in mind if you're sort of freestyling a bit with what you're cutting. And if you haven't seen it before, I'm using a slope to cut on because I have back problems, so I find it much easier to work on a slope. And I'm using non-slip matte. It's actually for rug underlay here on the table so that things don't move about. for close cutting like this, I'm not going massively deep. When I come to clean out large areas, then I do need to go down quite deep, quite close to the backing cloth to take things out cleanly. But in spaces here where the lino is actually, there are little gaps in between, but there's still lino there to support the paper, I don't need to go very deep. And one of the mistakes people sometimes make at the start when they're cutting is to think that everything needs to be cut at the same depth, whereas actually small detail can be shallow. And indeed, if you try to cut small detail too deeply, it can actually get quite messy and crumbly. So vary the depth of the cutting according to the size of the area that you're cleaning out. And you can see maybe also that as I'm cutting, sometimes I'm wiggling the tool just to get a slightly more random, softer edge to the cutting. Just gives it a little bit more of a lively edge. So I might leave a few little extra bits in between these shadow areas because I can always chop them out later when I'm proofing and seeing how the print looks. You know, you can always edit it and take more out. What you can't really do is stick more back in unless you cut another block. So, you know, if you think that you might like it, leave the lino there, take a proof print, decide if you like it, and if you don't, then you can cut it out. And I hope you'll notice that while I'm working, my left hand is supporting me, but it's also staying well behind the blade. One of the things that I'm quite strict about in class is how people hold their hands, because if you fall into the habit of cutting with your hand like that, it's a habit you then have to break. So, you know, when you start out, it's a good idea to get into the habit of always having your non-dominant hand behind the cutting tool. I learnt that the hard way, and it's better to avoid the accidents if you can. That's always the question that school kids ask me, is how often I cut myself. And the answer is quite a lot, but it's usually with paper, not with tools. Now when it comes to the bottom here, what I'm looking at is this part of the tree here that's in shadow, and I'm cutting it so that it contrasts with the trunk. Trunk's very smooth, so that's a nice straight smooth cut. Here I'm muddling up the cutting to give that kind of lots of leaves feel to the edge of that block. So there you can see a very different, sort of very smooth cutting. I think I'm going to add a bit more shadow here. Again, I can always edit that out if I don't like it when I see it in the final bit, but I just feel like I'm a bit more going on there. And technically I should just chop away. There should be, the shadows are here and here, there's none there, but I'm not sure about that boundary yet, so I'm just going to have a little think about it while I'm cutting. So when I cut, I always start with the sort of obvious stuff first that I know's got to be cut away, and anything like a boundary line or something where I'm not sure what I'm going to do, I leave until I've had a good think about that. And if you watched any of Grayson Perry's art club on, I think it was on Channel 4, I was very comforted by him saying, don't start with the clever bit of the drawing first, always start with kind of the easy stuff and work towards the tricky stuff. So in a way, he's sort of saying the same thing. Start with the obvious and work your way towards the ambiguous when you're cutting. So I'm going to take out this sky area now, which needs a bigger scoop, and also I need to go deeper. So I've been working a lot with V tools to get this kind of sketchy feel, and now I'm going to swap over to U gouges to clean out. So the first thing I'm going to do is to go around the areas that I've cut with the smallish one, just to protect them. So I always tend to work like this. I'll isolate where I've been cutting before I clean any large areas out, so that I have kind of a protective trench. You probably see it around this little one here. I'm just going to do a sort of bit of a wiggle round it to give myself a bit of a protective area before I get clearing. And then I can go up a size. And you can see I'm very much using my left hand as a brake here, because you know it's so easy to slip, and also how I cut depends on the weather sometimes. I mean, it's really hot at the moment by British standards, and the lino's nice and soft, so I can be a bit bolder about how I'm cutting because the lino's not fighting me. If it were a December morning and the lino was really hard, I wouldn't be cutting from here towards that block there, because the danger of the lino being hard and the tool just skipping would be too high. So I do vary my cutting technique depending on the weather and how soft the lino is to cut. And here I've just split this up so that I can get a nice big scoop and go in and take out. The bigger the scoop, the fewer ridges it will produce, and it's the ridges that create little high points that can pick up the ink. Some people like that. Some people like the ridges picking up the ink, and you know, I see prints quite often that I think are beautiful because of those ridges, but I don't work like that. My lino cuts tend to be very clean in that respect. And here, what I'm doing is I'm using the side of the scoop to slide under the lino. So my scoop is actually not up against the edge, it's under the lino. But because the edge already has a little cut down it, it's just lifting away. So I quite often use the side of tools to cut with. And that's just something that comes, you know, with practice and experience, and you get a feel for, you know, what the lino will and won't do. And again, it can depend on the weather and stuff like that, how sharp your tools are. But what I'm aiming for here is a nice low, smooth place. Fortunately, with Multiblock, you get to do lots of proofing and testing, and if there's anything high that's catching any ink, then I can cut it away as I go. Oh, and you'll see I made a decision about the boundary line that I was talking about earlier, and I wasn't sure if I'd leave that line or not. So what I've done is I've sort of broken it up with some sketchy little marks, and I am going to leave some lino there to print, but if I feel it's intrusive or it's not working, then I'll just take it out later. And I've talked about wiggling the tool from side to side to give a random cut. The other thing that a little bit of a shimmy like that will do is it will slow the tool down. So, you know, if I'm doing a delicate bit, sometimes I'm just easing the tool, just being careful. I think one of the most useful things to learn is just occasionally just to take your time, slow down. Because I'm as guilty as everyone. And actually, funnily enough, the more tired I get, the more I rush. It's sort of, there comes a point where you're just desperate to get things done and you start rushing, and that's never good. I'm trying to avoid going down into the actual Hessian itself. You know, it's not the end of the world if you do, but if you do go down to that Hessian or burlap layer, then you tend to get hairy bits that can poke up and catch the ink and transfer onto your print. So it's just another thing you have to watch out for if you go down too low. And before I start printing, I always have a good look over my block and check for loose hairs and things like that. And give it a really good brush down as well to get rid of anything that's on the surface. But I'm sure we'll look at that when we get to the printing end of this. So before I go, I just wanted to take a rubbing to show you how these cut marks are actually looking. So I'm going to use a graphite stick. I buy ones made by Lyra, and they're very cheap and cheerful, and they're good for doing rubbings, but they're also quite nice to draw with. And the other thing I'm going to use is some newsprint, which is very cheap paper. I buy mine as a packaging thing from removal companies. I buy it by the kilo, it's very cheap, and I use it for rubbings and all sorts of other things. So I often take a rubbing just to show me I am on the right track. So let's just get this done and I'll show you, and I can already see something that I want to correct. The nice thing about a rubbing is that it sort of highlights any issues, and it's also a great way of checking you haven't missed anything as well. So if I now show you, let's put that against a bit of white paper so you can see clearly. If I just show you this rubbing, and you can maybe see that I'm keeping that kind of sketchy quality of the original drawing. But as always, once you start cutting it into lino, it starts to look a bit edgier. But looking at this, I can immediately see I don't like this bit here. This is a conifer, and a conifer's all spiky upward shapes. And here I've got in the middle of it rather a flat and ugly area. So if I go back down onto my block, it's here. And I just need, all I need to do is just go back in and just break that up a little bit. Just correct that a fraction. So it's a tiny detail, but little bits like that, a rubbing will often show you, and you can just go in and correct it and keep everything looking as it should, and then there'll be a nice fluency to your print. So I hope that's been interesting. I always wonder if it really is interesting to watching me cut like this, but hopefully it has been. And I'll see you in another video. Thanks. Bye.